Hi everyone and welcome to week 5 of your course 9857. This week we're focusing on sex, gender and sexuality. My name's Gabriel from the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative and we'll be doing this lecture for you today. Before we get started today, I would just like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land in which we are watching this presentation from, where I am at the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge their continuation and contribution to culture in the region. So a quick introduction of what we'll cover today is we'll start with a bit of a 101, and that'll be the bulk of the lecture. This is a bit of an orientation to terms around gender, sex and sexuality. We'll have a bit of a look into some of the data that we have in Australia and a little bit about the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative. You'll cover a bit more in your tutorials. This has typically been adapted from what is a 3-hour presentation, so you'll just have a 1-hour overview of that content today. Before getting into the rest of the presentation, we'd also just like to acknowledge that we are talking about this from a very modern and very Western point of view, and we want to acknowledge there's a diversity of views and opinions and values and ideas in this space, and we encourage you to hold all of these values that you have and these ideas that you have and try and integrate it with what we're covering today. It would be great to open this up to some broader discussion in your tutorial groups, but please try and lean in and learn what you can from the next little bit. So a large part of what we're actually going to be covering and talking about today is identity. Up here on the slide, you can see a couple of different graphics and ways that we can talk about identity. The image on the left of your screen is the USIP. This is really a great tool for sort of all ages. You can adapt it for primary school right up through to high school about the different kind of parts that we have with our identity. The idea is that you have different ingredients that you mix together, and this makes a soup or a stew, and that's sort of a unique combination of ingredients that represents you as a person. There's worksheets and activities around this resource that you can look up online. And then the images on the right hand of the screen is about intersectionality. So different aspects of who we are as people, things that make up our identity, different kinds of identities that we hold and how they interact and intersect with each other. Today, and the focus of this presentation and also what the work that the initiative does is around sex, gender and sexuality and the diversity in these areas. So we'll really focus on those aspects, but they're not the only aspects of human identity. As already mentioned, the 3 areas that we're going to focus on is sex, gender, and sexual orientation. These are discrete and distinct aspects of human identity, and they're aspects of human experience that everyone has. So it's really important to not just conceptualize or think of these in an LGBTIQA+ space or in a queer sort of context. That these are just universal aspects of human identity. They are distinct and separate, but they do interact for some people, and for most of us it will sort of be related, but they are separate. So we'll kind of unpack that a bit more in the next little bit. So the first concept we'll talk about is sex. This is in terms of the body and biological sex, not in terms of reproduction. So sex really refers to the biological characteristics that are used to categorize bodies as either female or male. These characteristics include things like chromosomes, which are to do with our genetics and our DNA, hormones, particularly sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen. So all bodies produce testosterone and estrogen, just in different amounts. Our genitalia, so these are the external genitals. Reproductive organs, so things like testes, ovaries, the uterus, and parts that are inside the body. And secondary sex characteristics, so these are things that emerge around puberty, such as facial and body hair, breast development, hips, shoulders, muscles, that sort of thing. Genitalia is the most apparent or the most obvious of these at birth, so that's typically what a doctor will use to assign a sex of an infant. So they'll have a look at the genitals of the baby and decide if it's female or male just based on that alone. But you can see that it's actually a bit more complicated than that when we look at the other sex characteristics such as the chromosomes, hormones, genitals. reproductive organs, and secondary sex characteristics. So for a lot of people in the population, these don't actually neatly line up the way that we would expect them to. So when we actually look at the biology and the distribution of these characteristics, instead of this pattern we see here below with a male and a female box, what we actually end up with is something much more like this. Now, most people will be in the typical male or the typical female end of this sort of scale, but there is a decent part of the population in that middle space where things might not line up as typically expected. So for those people in the middle of the scale that we showed before, where their sex characteristics don't neatly align with a male or a female sort of expectation or pattern, we've got a broad catch-all term here called intersex that would describe those people. So it is a broad sort of umbrella term for people born with natural variations in their biological sex characteristics. And we've got over 40 known variations, so over 40 known ways that people can just be born with biology that slightly doesn't fit the expectation, or quite considerably doesn't fit the expectation of what we would expect to see for a typical female or a typical male biology. It includes all the different areas that we talked about before on the previous slide, so chromosomes, genitals, reproductive organs, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics. Typically, it's sort of considered or spoken about as if it's very, very rare. This is actually not the case. So when we look at all 40 known variations, we can roughly sort of say from the data that it's about 2% of the population. So 2% of the population is 2 people in every 100. Typically, most schools have got over 100 students, so you've got a considerable group of students in each school or in each setting and any other part of the community where intersex people are around. So 2% also doesn't sound like a lot, but 2% is the same number of people that are twins, that have red hair, that have got green eyes, that are British. So you can probably guarantee in Australia you've got a classroom or a school with a kid with red hair or a set of twins, and the same goes for intersex people. The only difference is that intersex is to do with the body and usually the internal or not observable parts of the body. So it's a lot less apparent or a lot less visually present in the school, but there's absolutely intersex people in schools and in classrooms across Australia and in the ACT. Really important things to note is that people who are intersex may or may not be aware that they have an intersex variation. But what's important is from a 2016 research study that we have here in Australia, they found out that most people that were intersex found out before the age of 18. So from birth to 18, pretty much covers most of the schooling, or all of the schooling years for young people. So particular points as well where they find out if they're not finding out when they're young children is around puberty. So that's a big thing in primary schools and also later in high schools. So depending on the nature of the variation, it might be picked up at birth if it's something visually observable, for example, something to do with the genitals of the baby. That's usually picked up quite early, but that young person is generally not told until they're a bit older, as advised by the doctors. This is sort of a historical practice, but also still quite a current thing that happens here in Australia as well. Puberty is another key point when puberty changes don't happen or when they don't happen as expected, and that might be a point to get additional testing. And the same thing later in life for some people when they're attempting to become pregnant or to get someone else pregnant and that's not happening as expected, that can prompt some additional testing that might pick up one of these variations, particularly if it's something to do with the reproductive organs or the chromosomes. We don't routinely test or screen for them, so many people might not know that they're intersex at all. And some people might not ever find out in their whole lifetime. So unless they're doing extra genetic testing and extra ultrasounds and that sort of thing, it's also quite possible that it doesn't get picked up at all. Unfortunately, intersex people have historically and currently been subjected to some practices that are considered a human rights violation by the UN. And this is really these non-consensual normalizing surgeries. So particularly when it's picked up in birth and early childhood, many doctors and surgeons will recommend some sort of corrective or reparative surgery, which is not necessary, it's not life-saving, and it's generally cosmetic genital surgery or sterilizing surgery that would remove the reproductive organs. So these are sort of unnecessary and done without the consent of the individual. So either the process of going through surgery or going to doctors and specialists as a young person, or having scars and stuff that you can't explain, or finding out around puberty for a lot of young people produces a lot of trauma. So it's important to acknowledge in a school environment that you might be having a lot of issues around students' medical engagement, potentially having trauma responses and stuff in the classroom. So this is really actually quite important for educators to be aware of. Typically, intersex has also been lumped in with the LGBTQA plus queer sort of conversations, and that's not always helpful because it's also got quite a lot of parallels with the disability space and disability access, particularly in schools. With some variations, there can be more common sort of co-occurrences of things like ADHD and other sort of behavioral and cognitive stuff in the classroom. So it's just relevant for a whole lot of reasons. If the young person doesn't know or the family is very private about it, it might also be clear that as a teacher you don't know about this. But it's important to acknowledge that you might have that in the classroom and that that's something that's potentially important for someone, especially around puberty. If you go into primary school teaching, for example, that might become a really live issue for someone that's experiencing a bunch of this information or that disclosure. All right, so the next area we're going to talk about is gender, and we'll split that up because there's a lot of different things that we mean when we talk about gender. So one of the issues we have when we talk about gender is we don't actually always know exactly what people mean when we're talking about which aspect of gender are we talking about. So we'll briefly step you through all of them. We've got things like gender identity, gender presentation, and gender expression, which are kind of coupled, gender roles, the gender binary, and gender non-conforming. So these are just some of the things that we will talk about in the next couple of slides. So gender identity is probably the most common thing that people mean when we talk about gender. This is the way that a person will experience themselves or identify themselves within their cultural understanding of gender. Now, what I mean by this is gender is cultural, and you might have heard that spoken about before. All that means is that our ideas or our concepts of gender are really based in the cultural context that we come from. So depending on the period of time that we're talking about or the country that we're talking about, the actual idea and the concept of gender is really, really different. The easiest way to think about that is if we think about women in the 1950s, femininity and womanhood in the 1950s looks really different to modern womanhood in terms of gender equity and stuff that's happened in the last couple of decades. So the idea of what it is to be a woman now in modern context is pretty different to what it was in the 50s or to what it was if we go back to the 1800s and even further. So the cultural ways that we frame gender change with time and context. Gender identity also refers to a person's understanding of themselves as a man, woman, or a non-binary person or other gender within that cultural framing. So it's really how someone identifies with a concept, a cultural concept. So gender roles are really something that sort of is highlighted by the whole idea that gender is cultural. By the fact that we talk about gender being cultural and sex being biological, we don't actually create a hierarchy where one is more important than the other. They're both just as real and just as influential on a person. And in many ways, gender is actually probably more relevant to people because it's actually what we interact with more often than with the biology and the sex, which is generally what we only engage with in terms of doctors and medical and clinical sort of spaces and discussions. And other things like, so when we say gender is cultural, so is money, so is the value of items and objects. So it's as real a concept as currency. So gender roles are a particular sort of cultural idea or cultural values that particular behaviors or attitudes are appropriate for a particular gender. In different countries and different cultural contexts, the concepts of sex, gender, and sexual orientation are not actually as split up or are not split up in the same ways that we are sort of framing things here today. So there might also be an understanding of gender in relation to these behaviors. So, for example, we think about stereotypes. Stereotypes are a really easy way to conceptualize gender roles, that we say this is the role of a man in society, this is the role of a woman in society, and that includes behaviors and attitudes and the ways that people should go about their life. Gender roles are really like socially determined. They're not something that you're born with, or it's more something that you acquire or inherit. And we start modeling this to young kids from the moment that they're born. We start even doing this before they're born. So things like a gender reveal or planning a nursery with a particular theme and that sort of thing. We still have really strong gender roles in society. Many people don't follow these gender roles or these expectations, but they still exist. They're still very concrete, and you can go to any shopping center and see the boys section and the girls section really separated out with almost this like artificial color split of the pink dolls and the blue dinosaurs and trucks and whatever it is. And it seems like a bit of an overstated idea, but it really is that obvious and that apparent. The social construction of gender also encompasses things like rights, responsibilities, constraints, and privileges assigned to people of a particular group. So an example, I was talking earlier about sort of gender equity, and this has been a big thing in the last couple of decades and a big thing in education. If we go back a couple of decades or even a couple of 100 years, there's real restrictions on the education that women and girls were able to attain and the kind of jobs that they could do. So that's an idea of like a culturally specific gender role and a time specific gender role. They change and evolve all of the time, and what we're getting sort of more and more at the moment is a dissolving of these barriers and a dissolving of these gender roles. There's a lot more sort of androgyny and pushing boundaries and barriers with gender roles at the moment. So gender presentation and gender expression are sort of a coupled sort of concept, but they're not exactly the same. So a gender presentation is simply how someone presents their gender or themselves in a world in ways that we would socially deem as masculine, feminine, androgynous, or neutral. So we have certain ideas that certain clothing or certain ways of presenting ourselves to the world are more masculine and some are more feminine. So we typically say like a suit and tie is a bit more of a masculine clothing choice, whereas dresses and skirts are typically seen as more feminine. And then there's a lot of androgynous and neutral sort of clothing options and expression and stuff like that. So it goes beyond clothing. It also includes how we talk and present ourselves, jewelry and accessories, how we cut and style our hair. So there's still even a prevalent idea that longer hair is feminine and shorter hair is masculine. And these are all very like loose and moving categories, but they're still sort of cultural ideas that we have. Now, where a presentation and an expression would differ is a gender expression is really a way that someone would present themselves to show or signal their gender. So for some people, it's really important to signify masculinity by growing out a beard. And for some people, they want to signal their femininity by having really long hair. And it might be something that they do to present their gender outwardly to other people so that other people acknowledge that. And we all do this on a subconscious level through our clothing choices and our own fashion and our own styles. And even if we don't intend to do something, we're always sending a message by how we present ourselves. So an expression would be something that is intended to communicate a gender to someone else. Whereas a presentation can be the same thing, but where it slightly differs is it could also just be how someone looks at first glance. It might just be what we assume when we see someone just from how they're looking, and that might not necessarily be something that they're trying to do to reflect their gender. It's just the way that we see them and conceptualize that. So for someone who, for example, might be not out, so in the closet, about being transgender, might present themselves in a way that's, if their gender identity is feminine, they might present in a masculine way to conceal or cover that up, so people that read them more masculinely, because they're not ready to come out and tell people that. Whereas a gender expression might be that they've affirmed that femininity and they're dressing in a way that it highlights or accentuates or communicates that femininity. So that's why they're coupled. It's a very sort of fine line where they're different, where they differ, um, but they are sort of vaguely the same sort of concept. Now, the gender binary is one westernized way that we can conceptualize or think about gender. So this is the idea that there's two genders, there's female or male or man, woman. This idea is not universal, and it's something that really started in sort of westernized countries and then spread to other countries, particularly through colonization. And what we see is where there are other ideas or concepts about gender and ways that gender is perceived and interacted within society, when this westernized way comes through colonization, it really takes over and sort of affects the system of gender in other countries. So there's examples of gender diversity and gender systems with three or more genders in many societies, and most traditional and indigenous societies around the world have a concept of gender diversity. There's examples in India, Thailand, the Pacific Islands, even in Australia. But again, a lot of the language is lost to the process of colonization, and new language is also invented and conceptualized to address that as well. For many people, they do just conceptualize or experience gender as man and woman, and that's it. And that's quite comfortable for a lot of people. So both cisgender and transgender people. So we'll unpack these terms in a little bit. Cisgender is basically people that are not transgender, so people that are assigned a sex at birth and they agree with that sex and that gender for the rest of their lives, and transgender people, which is where that differs. So all people of any sort of both cis and trans can be quite comfortable with the gender binary in terms of that's a model that suits them. But for many people as well, that model is very restrictive and doesn't actually represent where their experience is in terms of how they understand themselves, but also is not reflective or respectful or understanding of their cultural understanding of gender or their cultural background. So gender non-conforming is another sort of concept around gender, and this is mainly to describe people that don't conform to the social or cultural or sometimes even religious expectations around those gender roles that we talked about before. So it's just a term for anyone, regardless of their gender identity, who present or act in a way that is not deemed masculine or feminine, based on what the expectation of their behavior should be. So it's not limited to people who are transgender or gender diverse. So the clearest example is masculine women and feminine men. Um, Again, using the example from before, if we went back to the 1800s and a woman had a shaved head, that would be considered gender non-conforming, because the expectation was that women had long hair. So it doesn't have anything to do with a gender identity or being transgender or anything like that. It's just when people don't follow the expected rules for those gender roles. Okay, so now we're just going to get into some of the specific terms. I've already touched on a couple of those, but we'll just get in and talk about those in the next little bit. All right, so the first term we're going to talk about is transgender. Below is the flag for transgender community. Transgender is sometimes shortened to the word trans, and it refers to a person who's got a gender identity that differs from the assumption of their identity based on their biological sex. So what that means is, for example, a baby is born and has a penis. The doctor says that the baby is male, and the family raises that baby as a boy. When that child is old enough and they're able to express views and verbalize that to other people or even just to themselves, um, that'll be a gender identity that is different from boy or male or man. So that could be something that differs from a binary understanding of gender altogether. So they might say, I'm not a boy, I'm non binary, or another gender term. or it could actually be in line with the gender binary and they say, well, I'm not a boy, I'm actually a girl. So that's pretty much in the simplest form what we mean by transgender. So some other terms, and one that came across from the other slide, is the terms non-binary and the term gender diversity. So the non-binary flag is underneath non-binary. It's the yellow, white, purple, and black. Non-binary is an umbrella term for various gender identities that fall outside of a male-female gender binary. So anything in that sort of other, or sometimes it's even conceptualized as a third category. Gender diversity is a broad term that sort of is inside the, or includes the non-binary spectrum. So there's a range of different gender identities that are under non-binary. Some of the terms that we have here is genderqueer, gender fluid, and agender. So those are the flags across the top in the same order. So some people that are gender diverse or non-binary will consider themselves to be transgender, but some people might not. So it's a really individual sort of experience. For people who are genderqueer, they might view that their gender is something completely different or completely other than male or female, or what we kind of conceptualize that. People who are gender fluid might feel that their gender identity or expression fluctuates and moves throughout the course of time over a period of days to weeks, or even within a day. And agender are people that view that they have no gender, no experience of gender. Now, these definitions are what's kind of current, and at the moment, these also change, and they're also really individual to the person that's using them. So a really important thing that we say with all of these areas and stuff that we are talking about today, the language doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is talking to that person and treating that person in front of you as the person in that you're interacting with. So it's really important if a student does come out and use one of these labels or an identity that you might not have heard of before or are not sure about, or even if it's one that you do think you know, it's really important to work with that young person and ask them what that means for them, because we know that people will use language to mean different things, to talk about different concepts, and it just might be what they're familiar or comfortable with. So any of those definitions that I provide won't necessarily be the true definition for that one person, because people will use language in all different ways. So really important note there, just to respect that young person and to ask them about what that means for them and what they think that you need to know to support them as their teacher. So cisgender and transgender are some words that I've already touched on. Cis and trans are Latin words, and they're mostly used in chemistry, mathematics, and science. Cis meaning on the same side of, and trans meaning on the opposite side of. So when we apply this to gender, cis being on the same side of is cis meaning that the gender aligns with what was assigned at birth, and trans meaning that a gender does not align with what was assigned at birth. This has been introduced as a way of normalizing gender diversity when we talk about it. So instead of having transgender and normal, we've got transgender and cisgender, and it creates a way of talking about gender without an us and them sort of framing, which has some negative and unequal ways of talking about it. So for example, a cisgender woman is a woman that was assigned female at birth, and a transgender woman is a woman that was not assigned female at birth. That's as simple as that is. So the main takeaway here is that sex and gender are not the same thing, and they can't be used interchangeably. That you can't use someone's sex to infer their gender and all the aspects thereof. So identity also doesn't have anything to do with roles, which doesn't have to do with presentation or expression. So these are all sort of individual aspects of a person. Gender affirmation is a term that you might have been hearing around a bit more often now. We used to also refer to it as gender transition or transitioning. Sometimes that language is still used. So that just basically means when a person makes changes to their life or their expression to match their sense of self and their gender identity. So there's different ways that people affirm their gender, and not all people do all types of gender affirmation. The below sort of steps are also not some sort of linear progression. Some people will do none of these things. Some people will do all of these things. Some people will do only some of them, and they can happen in any order for that person. So a personal gender affirmation is just understanding in yourself how you feel about a particular thing, and you might be doing things to make yourself feel a bit better, but you're not communicating to other people. It might just be that you're doing something in your own personal time or having some positive self-talk in your head or whatever it is that's just for you. Social gender affirmation is then when you communicate that to loved ones, to friends and family, to other people, and people will come out and tell different people at different points in time, and they might be out and open with their friends, but not necessarily out and open and ready to talk to their family, for example. So social transition is the one that we see being most common, particularly relevant in primary schools, um, and also in high schools when people will first come out, and that might involve things like using a different name or changing the use of pronouns that someone uses or how they're referred to. Uh, Legal transition or legal gender affirmation is the actual legal process of undergoing a change of details. So changing a name, changing a marker of sex on a birth certificate, and there's various different steps to that on different forms of ID. And medical gender affirmation would include things like hormones and surgery. Generally, this is not sort of something that schools need to be concerned about because it's something that is engaged with the person and their family, and it's also generally something that happens when people are a little bit older. Medical gender affirmation can also involve for younger children before and around the age of puberty is puberty suppression. And that's another medical sort of decision that's made with the family and the young person and their medical team. So as teachers and educators, that's not something that you need to particularly worry about, particularly the medical and legal stuff. The social transition is really where you can make a big difference in young people's lives in terms of providing some structure and support for when people do change their name, their details, and want to be referred to with different pronouns and those sort of things. The third area we're going to talk about today is sexuality. So this is the area that people are most familiar and most comfortable with, so we won't spend too long on this. Sexual orientation refers to the ways that people experience sexual attraction to other people. It includes people who are attracted mostly to people of a different sex or gender than themselves. We call this heterosexual or straight. People who are attracted solely or predominantly to those of the same sex or gender. We call this homosexual. Some other terms are gay and lesbian. So we've got the rainbow flag here, which is generally the sort of all LGBT community flag that everyone uses, but it's also recognized as a gay flag, and next to that is a lesbian flag. It also includes people who experience attraction to more than one sex and gender, for example, bisexual and pansexual. We've got the bisexual flag on the left and the pansexual flag on the right. And it also includes people who experience no or limited sexual attraction, for example, asexual and demisexual, the asexual flag being the one on the left and the demisexual one on the right. Romantic orientation is much like sexual orientation, however, it's a non-sexual equivalent of this. It includes similar terms to sexual orientation. So instead of heterosexual, there's heteroromantic. Instead of homosexual, there's homoromantic. Then biromantic and panromantic, aromantic and demiromantic, much like the sexual orientation, but this just doesn't have a sexual component to it. So this is more referring to sort of crushes and wanting to spend time with people, form romantic relationships with people, and this can be independent and separate to sexual orientation. So that brings us to the end of our content on sex, gender, and sexuality. So that's really the 101 content out of the way now. The next bit we'll focus on is the schooling experiences. So this is looking at some of the data that we have on LGBT students in Australia. So in Australia, we've been really, really lucky and fortunate to have a lot of research. There's been a huge amount of work coming out of La Trobe University right back to the 90s. So we've got some really good data here in Australia. These are a couple of the main pieces of research that we have out there. What I'll be focusing on in the next little bit is the writing themselves in report. So this year we had the writing themselves in 4 report launched. Writing themselves in 3 was about 10 years old, and we were using that for a long period of time, but now we've got something a bit more updated. Free to Be is another survey. We've got trans pathways for trans youth, growing up queer, from blues to rainbows, and private lives too. So most of the other ones are a little bit out of date, and we're waiting on some new editions of those. We've also got some work coming out of Australian researcher Tiffany Jones. She's got one on the school experiences of trans and gender diverse students in Australia, and another one on the needs of intersex students. And her work on intersex students is some of the only research that we have. So Writing Themselves in 4 was released in February this year, and it's actually the most recent and also the most substantial data that we have on this cohort of young people and their health and well-being. The data was collected in 2019 between September and October. So what is really useful about this data is we've got mental health and population statistics that predate COVID. So when we have a look at this, this is just like almost like a baseline look without the exacerbation of the mental health and wellbeing statistics we expect to see from the COVID-19 situation. This is a national report with about just under 6,500 young people nationally. The age range is 14 to 21 years. And we've also got state and territory reports. They're all available online for free access. For the first time ever, though, we have an ACT sub-report, so the ACT government funded part of this research, and the cohort within the ACT is 300 young people. So of the 300 people in the ACT, the average age was just around 18 years old, so 17.9. This captured people that had been at school recently or had just left school. The statistics are a little underrepresented for what we expect in the ACT, with only 2% Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander and 11.7% born overseas. Unsurprisingly, we have a large percentage of the cohort, just under 50%, reporting having a disability or long-term health condition. These are specified and divided out in the national report, but not for the ACT report. The majority of people that we got participating, just over 50% being cisgender women, with only 2.8% transgender women. We've got 16.3% being cisgender men and 6.9% being transgender men, and the remaining 19.4% non-binary. So it's a pretty good spread. Intersex people were recruited for the survey, but unfortunately not enough respondents got back and completed the survey for there to be separate statistics, for that to be statistically significant. So the data is included in the main cohort, but is not pulled out as a separate statistic. For the sexual orientation reporting, we've actually got the largest proportion reporting bi and pansexual. So the biggest sexuality percentage of the cohort was bisexual at 33.1% and 12.7% being pansexual. Gay and lesbian participants were sort of equally reported, around 12% each. 8% reporting as queer and 14.7% reporting something else. We've also got about 7.4% reporting as asexual. What we found from this research is that there was still persistent and high levels of harassment and discrimination experienced by LGBTQA plus young people. So the graph on the left, the blue represents ever having an experience of this, and the green representing having an experience of this in the last 12 months. And this first one here is verbal abuse. So 59.2% of the cohort had ever experienced verbal abuse, and 40% that said that that had been in the last 12 months. 17% had reported physical harassment, and 9% of that cohort said it was in the last 12 months. Sexual harassment was reported at 38% having ever experienced it, and 29% having experienced that in the last 12 months. So that's actually quite high when we look at the general population. That's really unfortunate, and there's a lot of work to happen there. So what we do have is young people experiencing high rates of discrimination and harassment in these sort of categories. And this is happening both at school and in broader society. What we also see, and this is coupled with the experiences of harassment and discrimination, is really high rates of poor mental health. So what they did in this study with writing themselves in is they used the standard test. This is a K10 psychological test that rates mental and psychological distress in 4 categories of low, moderate, high, and very high. So the 16 and 17-year-olds from this study were pulled out to match another study of the general population from the same period of time that was just 16 and 17-year-olds, and they've been compared here on the graph that you can see on the right. So the cluster to the left of that graph is from the writing themselves in cohort. So these are our LGBT young people. 58% had indicated on the test that they had a very high level of psychological distress, with 32% reporting high psychological distress. So that's the majority of the cohort there. We have nearly 90% of the cohort having high or very high psychological distress. And on the inverse of low to moderate, so low being 4.4% and moderate being 5.8%. So we've got around 10% having low to moderate. This is a really different picture from what we see when we compare it to the graph next to it, which is from the general cohort of young people. So the general cohort of young people reported 43.6% having low psychological distress, and a further 29.2% having moderate psychological distress. So already we have 60% of the cohort compared to 10% of the other cohort in that low category. Again, for the general population, 16.2% had high psychological distress and 11% had very high psychological distress. So it's a really, really different picture from what we're seeing for our LGBT young people, where the majority are clustered in the high distress range. As I mentioned before, there's a really mixed picture when we look at this data, and particularly when we look at the data in the ACT. Having an ACT report means that we can compare where we're doing better or not so well with the national average around Australia. So 2 main areas where the ACT was not doing as well as the national average was access to toilet and change room facilities and school attendance. So these are areas that we need to do a bit more work on. Where we were not doing as well, there's about a margin of 5 to 7% on average where we're not doing as well. By contrast, though, there's a lot of areas where we are doing better than the national average. So in these following categories, we're doing much better than the national average, and these are visual images that support the diversity of LGBTIQA students, celebrating days of significance such as Wear It Purple and Ida Hobbit Day, students feeling safe to openly identify as LGBTIQA+ at school, students feeling safe to wear gender-affirming clothing and uniform. Now, we believe this can be tied to the gender-inclusive uniform policy that the Education Directorate has put in place. That classmates were supportive of their identity, that teachers were supportive of their identity, that there was awareness of LGBTIQA+ groups at school, particularly in high schools, and that they felt that they were able to use their name and pronoun while at school. Now, compared to the 5 to 7% where we were not doing so well, where we are doing better, there's between 20 and 30% boosts in some of these categories. So we're doing quite a lot better in some of these areas. That said, even in these areas where that 20% boost or 30% boost is getting us is to around 60%. So there's still around 40% of students where these are not the case, so there's still absolutely more work to be done here in the ACT. What this report also does really well is it highlights some protective factors and things that made some of those mental health outcomes better for young people. So the main ones were having supportive classmates, supportive school leadership, inclusive school environments, support from family, community engagement and activism. Now this included things like having a student group at school, but also doing those celebration days like Ida Hobbit and Wear It Purple, and having access to information resources. Now as teachers and educators, providing as much of this as you can is also going to help to contribute to those mental health statistics that we saw in the previous slides. So it's really important to think of ways that you can foster these sort of environments, provide this information and resources, and create inclusive environments. So for this last section, we're just going to talk about the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative and some of the work that we do. The SAIS initiative really came about in 2016 following some of the work from the Safe Schools Coalition. The Safe Schools Coalition no longer exists in the ACT and it belongs now in Victoria in their Department of Education. But the Safe and Inclusive Schools initiative was developed with the ACT Education Directorate, Catholic Education, Independent Education, the PNF groups and a few other stakeholders. So what we do is guided by what we call these key messages. So we'll just go through each of these here. So the first one is that school's been reported as a site where same-sex attracted, intersex and gender diverse students have experienced prejudice, discrimination, harassment and bullying. So this is really why we focus on the school environment and the school experience. So the second key message is that children and young people who don't feel safe cannot learn effectively. This is really why we've focused on creating safe and inclusive environments and making sure students are best supported to do the best work that they can. The third key message is that we want everyone to be able to be themselves at school, to feel safe and welcomed for who they are. So this ties into key message 2. So we know for a lot of LGBT young people that if they have to conceal and hide who they are, that is a big source of anxiety and stress, and it also means that they can't learn effectively at school. We don't want them to feel like they have to leave parts of themselves at home or that they can't be who they are in a school environment. The fourth key message is that safe, supportive and inclusive school environments can make significant and positive differences to the wellbeing outcomes of young people. Not only is this common sense, it is also backed by decades of research. We know that the work that you do, having supportive and inclusive school environments and teachers that are affirming of diversity, has positive impacts for mental health and wellbeing outcomes for young people. This infographic shows where the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative sits. The broadest umbrella in purple is federal legislation that includes human rights and anti-discrimination acts. Within this, we've got ACT legislation around education, human rights and discrimination. Then we have the policies and frameworks that are in place both nationally and within the ACT. So some of these include the National Safe Schools Framework, the Safe and Supportive Schools Policy in the ACT, the Wellbeing and Diversity Framework, the National Schools Improvement Tool, and Individual School Policy. The next level is community. This includes health and community organisations like sexual health and family planning, parents and citizens and friends associations, and unions and staff and professional associations for teaching staff. Within the community, we have a focus on the education sector, including ACT Education Directorate, Catholic Education Office, and the Association of Independent Schools of the ACT. Within the education system, we've got lead schools that really champion our work and have been instrumental in setting up and establishing the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative. Within these schools, we've got principals, wellbeing staff, educators, parents and carers, and the students that make up our community. Within this is what has allowed the Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative to become what it is today. One of the main differences between the Safe Schools Coalition and the ACT Safe and Inclusive Schools Initiative is the nature and focus of our work. The ACT Safe and Inclusive Schools initiative is no longer student-facing and has been instead focused on providing professional support to educators, school staff, executive teams, and other stakeholders. Our range of available supports includes things like our professional learning programs, which includes our 2-hour or 3-hour TQA accredited teacher training and non-accredited tailored training sessions. We also provide guidance in identifying and using high-quality teaching and learning resources. In particular, we have developed a tool for classroom teachers and educators to adapt and assess resources for their classroom. We also support leadership opportunities for staff and students, particularly through our Wear It Purple Day Small Grants program. Through this, students and teachers are able to nominate a project or an event to run for Wear It Purple Day, and we are able to provide them with a $200 grant to run the event. We also provide expert advice around individual student needs or issues within the school, and we are able to talk to teachers, parents, and educators. We also facilitate the sharing of good practice between key schools and places that are doing work within their school environment. Additionally, we also do lots of stakeholder engagement and community referrals to other peer organisations that are working in this space to provide the best support for staff and students. We have also recently developed a gender affirming practice guide for students affirming their gender at school, which has been released with the support of the ACT Education Directorate. We have now covered concepts around sex, gender, and sexual orientation, some aspects of identity, and some of the ways that this can be present in a school environment. So what can you do as future educators? Find out more in this week's tutorial. Thanks for having me.